Today we're going to take a look at the digestive system, and this is chapter 8 in your textbook. And there's not really an accompanying lab in the lab manual, so I'll just encourage you to take your textbook and take a look at the diagram of the digestive system. You'll find that around page 170 or so, depending on which version of the text you have. And so we'll start by thinking of what the digestive system does, what the functions are. You're probably familiar with the digestive system because every day you need to take in food in order to kind of satisfy the needs of the digestive system. And so we can say that the functions include processing and absorbing nutrients and eliminating wastes. And there are a number of interesting organs, and so what I thought I'd do today is walk you through one of the models, or two of the models, and take a look at some of these and some of the modifications that the organs have along the way. So if we think of the digestive system as a tube, starting at the mouth and ending at the anus, it's really just a giant tube through the whole body, and you could argue that it's, as the food is moving along, it might get taken in by the body, or it might not. It depends on what those materials are. And so the other thing that we want to consider is what happens along the way. So you take food in at the mouth, and the mouth has a really large tongue and teeth and some other components that would help mechanically digest the food, so crush and grind and break up the food into smaller pieces. What's less obvious are the salivary glands. You have 3 pairs of salivary glands that empty saliva into the mouth, and that would hydrate, really add water to help break down those nutrients, and also add enzymes, things that would help to break down the individual components of the food. For example, amylase. Amylase is one of the most common enzymes that breaks down starch. Starch is a really big molecule, too big for your body to absorb. So starting in the mouth with the salivary glands and that mechanical digestion, we would then prepare the food for swallowing. And the food packet that's formed is called a bolus. And so we actually have kind of a specialized process for swallowing that involves the epiglottis covering the larynx. We talked about the respiratory system before. And the food will pass from the mouth into the esophagus. Now, when it does that, there is a slight period of time when it's in the throat, the pharynx. And again, remember that's the shared passageway between the respiratory and digestive systems. Up to this point, there's pretty minimal chemical digestion. So I mentioned amylase, and that starts to chop up the nutrients, but it's really not doing a lot in terms of chemical digestion. And the esophagus, as you see here, would lie behind the trachea, so you can kind of feel the trachea or windpipe in your throat. The esophagus lies right behind that, and not a lot of digestion is happening in the esophagus. However, at that point we begin a process called peristalsis. The muscular layers of the esophagus are pushing the food along, pushing it down through the thoracic cavity, and in fact through the diaphragm, so there's a hole for the esophagus to go through the diaphragm to the stomach. And the esophagus is sometimes just called the food chute because it's not really doing a lot mechanically or chemically to the food. It's simply passing it to the next organ in the system. So at a quick glance, and then we'll take more time on each organ, at a quick glance, the stomach, there's a lot going on in the stomach, and we'll kind of back up to that in a minute. At the end of the stomach, we would start to enter the small intestine. And the small intestine would be the place where the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, which the pancreas aren't shown well here, they're kind of a narrow gland underneath the stomach, those empty into the small intestine. And so we'll use the larger model to take a closer look at that. From the small intestine then, we get this coiling, and you see this really kind of large, very long, about 27-foot long structure. The small intestine is where most of the nutrient absorption occurs, and then from there the food passes into the large intestine, through the rectum, and eventually out at the end of the tube. What I'd like to do is, I kind of wanted to show you this one. It's very simple first, but I'm going to go ahead and pull this model over and really take a closer look at some of these individual organs. So this model, as you can see, comes apart, and we'll just kind of remove some of the organs that are not relevant to this discussion. So lungs, heart, those kinds of things. And you get a sense on this model of that thoracic cavity, the heart and lungs located in the thoracic cavity, the diaphragm, that thin sheet of muscle that separates those thoracic and abdominal cavities then is right here. And if we think about the esophagus passed the food to the stomach, I'm going to go ahead and pull the liver out for a minute so we can talk about the stomach. So the stomach actually does quite a number of things. It's sort of a J-shaped organ. It's located very near the heart, and so that's going to be important as we think about acid reflux and how food might sometimes pop back up into the esophagus and give you what you call heartburn. If we look at the stomach internally, if we pop it open, you'll see that it's modified, and it's kind of stuck here. It's modified to expand. It has little folds of tissue called rugae, and those rugae allow the stomach to expand, and when they kind of fold up, it gets a little bit smaller. You've probably all at Thanksgiving stretched out your stomach with a large meal. So those rugae allow the increase in surface area. The other reason it's important that we have increase in surface area is that we get a lot of chemical digestion in the stomach. So there are a number of enzymes in the stomach that will work on particular nutrients. And although I don't want to go through each of those, an example would be something like pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that starts to work on proteins, and this is really the first place that we had protein digestion. Pepsin, the enzyme, doesn't work really well unless it's a very low pH. And so in the stomach, the pH of the stomach is lowered by the addition of hydrochloric acid, HCl. There are glands that secrete that all along the walls of the stomach. The other thing that is important about the stomach is a slight difference from the rest of the digestive system. And perhaps I can take this moment to kind of back up and talk about the layers of the walls of the digestive system, because the stomach has a modification to those walls. Most parts of the digestive system, starting with the stomach, most parts have 4 layers. We call a mucosal layer. I don't really have an image for this, but it's in the diagram on page 171. The mucosal layer lines the lumen, which is just the empty part of the tube. And the mucosal layer is epithelial tissue. It's got the glands that would secrete materials like mucus and enzymes into the respective organs. Then next to that, the next layer would be the submucosa. The submucosa is a connective tissue layer. It's going to bind the mucosal layer to the 3rd layer called muscularis. And the muscularis layer in most parts of the digestive system has 2 directions. Longitudinal, which would follow the length of the tube. So for example, the esophagus, longitudinal fibers would go the length of the tube, and then circular, so those that go around. The stomach is modified to have 3 muscularis layers. It actually has the circular, the longitudinal, and then oblique. And so I'm not sure if you can see that on the model, but they're trying to illustrate that extra muscularis layer. And that's because the stomach is going to be churning, and so it needs an extra muscle layer. And then again, this is shared among all the different layers. The outermost layer is called serosa, and the serosa is epithelial tissue that covers and binds some of those abdominal layers to each other. So again, the stomach is going to be modified to have that extra directional muscle fiber, and the idea is that it's sort of like a holding chamber. So you take in the food, your saliva begins to work on it, you pass it through the pharynx, through the esophagus, to the stomach, lots of churning, lots of enzymatic digestion, still no nutrient absorption. Up to this point, we haven't had any nutrient absorption. The stomach is going to squeeze food, which is now called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, it's kind of a soupy mixture, into the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is called small because of its diameter. It's not really small in terms of length. It's actually much longer than the large intestine, but it's very small diameter, and so the food is squeezed into the small intestine, and that's where we're going to finally begin nutrient absorption. One other thing about the stomach, kind of emphasizing some things here about the stomach, it is J-shaped. There's a little kind of hump on it called the fundus, F-U-N-D-U-S. The body is the main portion, and there are 2 little flaps of muscle that separate either the esophagus and the stomach, or the stomach and the small intestine. The one at the top is called the cardiac or gastroesophageal sphincter. Cardiac or gastroesophageal sphincter. Cardiac because it's so close to the heart. And then the one at the other end, this narrowed portion of the stomach, is called the pylorus, and so the sphincter at the other end is called the pyloric sphincter. When you have heartburn, if you've ever experienced that, when you have heartburn, basically what's happening is some of the acidic materials in the stomach are accidentally getting up into the esophagus, and you feel a burning sensation. And most people think, oh, it's the heart, and that's what they call heartburn. In fact, it's the esophagus. If it gets very severe, there's some medications that can be used to manage it, as well as timing your food and looking at the portion size and those sorts of things as well. But I always say talk to your medical doctor if you have those issues. So I think that's all about the stomach. Let's move on to the small intestine. And so as we do that, I do need to kind of put the liver back in place for one moment so that you can imagine something. The liver, which is a very, very large organ, has a number of roles in the body. When we think of the digestive system roles, it's going to be producing bile. The liver produces bile, which will help to break down fats. That bile is stored in the gallbladder, which is a gland. It's usually illustrated as green. It's sort of beneath the liver, and the gallbladder will squeeze the bile into the small intestine in regular doses. So that's one of the functions of the liver in terms of the digestive system. It's also going to process a lot of nutrients, and it's going to do other things along with, for example, the cardiovascular system. It's getting rid of old red blood cells and a number of other tasks. But for right now, it's making bile. The bile is stored in the gallbladder, and then those are squeezed into the small intestine. This model gives you a better sense of the pancreas, which are another gland. They would be what we call an exocrine gland, because they're secreting substances that are digesting, things like pancreatic amylase, and they're secreting that into little ducts, little tubes that would enter the small intestine. Later, when we get to the endocrine system, we'll find out that the pancreas are also an endocrine gland. They secrete some materials into the bloodstream as well. But in this situation, we're thinking of as an exocrine gland. So the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas are what we call accessory structures. They're not directly part of the tube, but they're important to what's going on in the tube. So, small intestine. Let's think about some modifications of the small intestine for its job. Inside the small intestine, we get nutrient absorption. So probably the most obvious modification are the presence of villi. Singular is villus, V-I-L-L-U-S. Plurals villi, V-I-L-L-I. And they're little finger-like projections. There's not really, on this model, there's not really a good way to see those. But if we could do a cross-section, and I know there's a picture in your text for this, if we could do a cross-section of the small intestine, page 176 in your textbook, you'd see these little projections, and they also have even tinier projections called microvilli, and the idea is to increase the surface area. So we finally start to get nutrient absorption. In order for that to happen, those enzymes produced by the pancreas, the gallbladder, the liver are all going to be working at that first portion of the small intestine. The first portion, the first 12 or so inches, are called the duodenum of the small intestine, D-U-O-D-N-U-M. So the duodenum is where we get some of the initial digestion. There's not really mechanical digestion here. It's really the kind of finishing touches on chemical digestion. And all along the length of that tube, we would be absorbing nutrients. So, a couple of points. The nutrients like carbohydrates and proteins, the amino acids that are really small enough to be absorbed, those are getting taken into the bloodstream, the systemic capillaries that are out there surrounding the intestine. The fats need some additional processing. The fats are going to be absorbed by the lymphatic system. They're absorbed into little capillaries called lacteals, L-A-C-T-E-A-L-S. And the lacteals kind of push the fats over to the liver where they can be digested and processed even more. And so that's kind of a unique factor in terms of nutrient absorption. So those materials are passing all along the small intestine. I mentioned the first 12 inches or so is called the duodenum. The next portion is called the jejunum, J-E-J-E-N-U-M, and the last portion is called the ileum. The ileum then would dump any materials that haven't been absorbed into the large intestine. And the large intestine, I kind of took it off and then I put it back on. The large intestine is also divided into some distinct regions. And maybe the most obvious would be this kind of blind pouch that's called the cecum. That's sort of the first part of the large intestine. On the cecum, there's a little structure called the appendix. It's sometimes called the vermiform appendix because it's almost a worm-like structure, vermiform meaning worm-like. We know the appendix has a role in the immune system. We're not exactly sure why it's located there and how that evolutionary trait has been passed on, but we do know it has a role in fighting infections in antigens that would be in your food. So the food, or the mostly waste materials at this point, are entering the large intestine, called large because of the large diameter, and this first region is called the ascending colon because the materials move from the small intestine into the large and then up. There is a little valve, again, a sphincter between the small and large intestine. It's called the ileocecal for the ileum of the small intestine and the cecum of the large intestine, ileocecal valve. Okay, those materials then are moved along the ascending colon, so moving up along the right side of the body. They move across the transverse colon from the right side to the left side, and then down the descending colon along the left side of the body. And again, along the way there are some modifications. Not so much nutrient absorption here, but water absorption. We reabsorb any water that was used along the digestive system. We don't want to eliminate a huge amount of water because then we have to take it in. So we reabsorb water. We also have some organisms living here. Most people are kind of delighted to find out they have bacteria living in their colon. They're called coliforms. There are a number of different coliforms. Probably the most familiar one would be Escherichia coli, or E. coli as it's called. And those bacteria are actually helping us digest things that we might not normally be able to digest. Think back to the last time you had some beans and the effects that those may have had on you. You can thank the bacteria that are in your colon. If you had some gas, the bacteria were able to digest those foods, the nutrients in those foods, but the byproduct that they made was the gas that you might have found uncomfortable or embarrassing. So those coliforms are also helping you absorb vitamins. So although I said there's not a lot of nutrient absorption, we do have some vitamins like vitamin K that get absorbed in the large intestine. Anything that's kind of leftover, waste material, what you might think of as fiber, so things that we aren't able to digest really well, will pass along that system. There are some folds of tissue here called haustra, H-A-U-S-T-R-A, and the haustra are increasing the surface area for water reabsorption. But then eventually those materials are packed into the rectum, which is kind of the last part of the tube, and it's sort of hidden here beneath. I'm not sure if I can pop this out. So if we look at this, we said ascending colon, transverse, descending. There's kind of an S-shaped curve. I'm not sure how clear that is, but there's an S-shaped curve called the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum is going to store the wastes, and eventually the anus then, which is at the end of the tube, would allow you to pass those waste products out of the body. And so that's kind of the tour of the entire digestive system. There's a lot more detail in the textbook, but what I wanted to do is just kind of walk you through those different parts and some of the modifications to those parts to do those different functions. So read Chapter 8. I'll post this in the lab quizzes section, or I'll post this in the Chapter 8 section, and then there'll be a lab quiz associated with this in the lab quiz folder on Blackboard.